Thank you very much. Sounded like Nicolai senile, but so yeah, I'm very grateful to the organizers for having me. So thanks, Mariana, for not vetoing this. If you can hear us. So I'm going to begin by going over what may be familiar starting points to some of you before leading up to the proper topic of my paper. As you might perhaps agree, the Quran is appositely viewed as a corpus of texts, as a diwan of sorts, or an archive. The component text from which this prophetic diwan, this archive, was compiled, so the suras, remain separate units that are clearly set off from each other, as illustrated by this early manuscript, for instance. It's not obvious that this is how things had to pan out. One can easily imagine that the redactors or redactor of the Quran might have integrated the proclamations left behind by Muhammad into a continuous narrative of the latter's life, just as the New Testament Gospels embed the sayings of Jesus in an overarching biographical storyline. Yet instead of such redactional fusion, the redactors of the canonical recension of the Quran largely seem to have confined themselves to arranging the individual surahs in a particular order, an order that often yields relationships of meaningful proximity and sequentiality. It isn't feasible, in my view, to disprove entirely the possibility that the Quranic redactors might also have intervened in the wording of the surahs themselves. I find it conceivable, for instance, that it was only the Quran's redactors who supplied the basmala openings at the beginning of almost all Quranic surahs. But the fact remains that the surahs have not been worked into an encompassing literary framework. And this indicates that the manner in which Muhammad's proclamations were organized into the Quranic archive was essentially conservative. Texts were included in the state that they had reached when the archive was assembled, rather than being subjected to extended further editing. In other words, it seems highly likely to me that the surahs are literary units that precede compilation, rather than having been created only in the process of compilation. And that's, of course, not a novel point. The primary texts that found their way into the Quranic archive are quite unitary in some ways and quite disparate in others. As regards unity, the Quran as a whole is shot through with a considerable amount of phraseology that is distinctively Quranic, and I would also agree that in terms of theological content, the Quran is a fairly consistent body of text, although it's emphatically not devoid of doctrinal diversity either. But where the Quran's internal variety is most striking is not with regard to theology, but with regard to literary form. Most obviously, Quranic verse length is conspicuously variable. Verses range from a few words to, in some cases, well over 450 transliteration characters. And that forms a stark contrast with Arabic poetry, where meter ensures virtually consistent verse length. And it's important here to remind ourselves that the boundaries of Quranic verses are determined by rhyme or verse final assonance. So verses are an objective constituent feature of the Quran, just as they are an objective constituent feature of poetry. As I've noted in an earlier publication, verse length is actually much more consistent within individual surahs than across the Quran as a whole, and that illustrates that the textual units in the Quranic archive that are the primary bearers of differences in literary form are the surahs. Among other things, surahs vary in length, in their opening devices, in their structure, and I think we have a pretty good grasp of that now, thanks to the work of scholars like Neil Robinson, Angelika Neuwirth, among others. To me, one of the fascinating traits of the Quranic archive is the fact that it seems possible to reconstruct from its literarily diverse component parts a process of literary evolution. So despite weighty objections and questions that have been posed by Emmanuel and Gabriel, who are both here today, I am still persuaded by Behnam Sadeghi's pioneering argument that the Quranic archive points to a course of stylistic development during which the constituent verses of the surahs tended to expand in length as time went by. Now, if we stick to the conventional timeline of the Quran's nascency, so roughly 2 decades, then the rate of literary change we can reconstruct from the Quranic corpus must have been quite rapid. So within roughly a decade, it seems, we go from a text like Surah 99, Az-Zalzala, on the screen, a brief vignette of the moment of resurrection, to a text like Surah 12, an extended retelling of the biblical Joseph novella, running to over 100 verses. Muhammad's revelatory deliverances, therefore, exhibited a considerable degree of literary mutability, a propensity to literary shape-shifting that differs notably from the much greater formal stability of Arabic poetry. From a purely historical perspective, it would not strike me as credible to maintain such a rapid development without assuming certain accelerating conditions. These accelerating conditions would have consisted in a host of ambient literary forms in the Quran's environment, which would have functions as paradigms driving the Quran's literary development, such as well-established forms of biblically based storytelling in Arabic. Now, the special interest of the surahs at the center of this conference, the 7 long ones, or the 7 macro surahs, as we might call them, is that they represent yet another leap in the literary complexity, even in comparison to texts like Surah 12, texts that are conventionally assigned to the later Meccan period of Muhammad's prophetic activity. The observation I just made is most iconically represented by Surah 2, Surah al-Baqarah, the longest verse in the Quran by some margin, as you can see on this graph. A text like Surah 12, whose 111 verses add up to a total of slightly more than 11,000 transliteration characters, is still comparable in length to a substantial qasida poem like the 88 verses of the Mu'allaqa of Labid, to take the edition of Ihsan Abbas. But a text like Surah al-Baqarah, with over 39,000 transliteration characters, is something else entirely. For comparison, Surah al-Baqarah is about 3 times the size of the biblical book of Amos, and roughly as long as the biblical books of Nehemiah or Daniel. So it makes sense to consider Surah al-Baqarah and the other macro surahs as conceptually akin to a biblical book, rather than resorting to the contrastive foil of qasida poems, as I've just done for Surah 12. In light of this, I cannot do better than echo an assertion that Mariana will make tomorrow. She was going to have spoken on the previous day. That is ruined now. That the disproportionate length of Surah 2 begs the question of how the long surahs coalesced. Like Mariana, I'm minded to see texts like the Book of Amos or Surah 2 as having emerged from a process of literary growth, and I'm interested in trying to discern whether any traces of such growth remain visible in the final product. That would be the equivalent of literary tree rings, I suppose, so you might call this Surah dendrochronology in a way. Based on a commentary that I'm currently writing on Surah 2, it seems to me that there are sufficient indications that such an assumption of gradual literary growth is indeed tenable. For example, take the second longest verse of Surah 2, verse 102, which I've here divided up into 5 segments. The basic point of the verse is to condemn the scripture owners, and probably the Israelites in particular, for preferring sorcery over adherence to God's scripture. The verse also advances an etiology of Jewish magical practices as going back via demonic instruction to 2 angels called Harut and Marut. As also recognized by Paul Neuenkirchen, the length of this verse is anomalous. Running to 466 transliteration characters, verse 102 is more than 3 times the length of the previous verse, which is itself very close to Surah 2's average of 137 point something transliteration characters per verse. So a possible explanation for this state of affairs would be to conjecture that the current version of the verse is the result of one or several insertions. Such an explanatory approach is supported by the fact that the phrase Solomon himself was not guilty of repudiation or unbelief, rather it was the devils who were, in segment 2 on the slide, looks very much like it might be a secondary gloss on the preceding statement, which alludes to what the devils recited during the reign of Solomon. Now, on the back of various considerations that would easily fill a conference paper in its own right, I would imagine that verse 102 grew or coalesced in 3 steps. The nuclear version of the verse may have been limited to the beginning and the end of the verse as we have it, which fit together quite seamlessly. This nuclear version was then, I imagine, spliced apart by an insertion spelling out that Solomon, whom the Quran generally presents as a righteous recipient of divine favors and benefactions, must not be held responsible for the choice of some later scripture owners to abandon God's scripture in favor of magic. This insertion furthermore identifies the illicit body of knowledge that is alluded to in the original kernel of the verse as sorcery, sihr, and it underscores that magic, though effective, does not operate independently of or even against God's will. I conjecture that subsequently, a second edition was lodged in the midst of the first one. This second insertion clarifies that magical knowledge, like other knowledge, ultimately originates from revelation, via 2 angels serving as an instrument of divine temptation. The second edition also concretizes the magical law at stake by explaining that, for instance, it enables sorcerers to cause marital discord. I obviously can't expect you to be persuaded of my analysis of this verse, given that I've omitted a lot of detail, but I would hope that you will at least grant that my redactional model for this verse has prima facie plausibility, despite being pretty intricate. So what I would like to take away from this brief look at verse 102 is the idea that Surah 2 as a whole may be the outcome of fairly complex processes of literary expansion and revision. Mariana will tomorrow give us an idea of the technologies that may have sustained such redaction, meaning that we do not have to anachronistically imagine the prophet or his scribes to have had access to modern word processing software in order for something like my hypothetical development of the Harut and Marut verse to be possible. Departing from such a general vantage point, I would therefore like to use the rest of this talk to sketch some general ideas about how Surah 2 may have reached its present size. Now, I just pointed out that the redactors of the Quran as a whole seem to have proceeded conservatively. They arranged pre-existing textual units into a running order, but did not work them into an overarching literary framework. My basic hypothesis for Surah 2 would be that this is a composition that exhibits a much less conservative editorial modus operandi. Specifically, I would like to make the tentative proposal that Surah 2 as we have it is a text that reached its eventual size and complexity by absorbing within it other and previously independent surahs. I'm assuming that most of this process happened under the auspices of Muhammad, but it would be conceivable for my redactional analysis of the surah to be correct, but my dating of it to be wrong, so that's a separate debate to be had. So let's begin with a look at the whole of Surah 2 before zooming in on specific parts. Relying on the work of other scholars, most notably Neil Robinson, I would subdivide the text into 4 main parts or panels. There is firstly a general prologue up until verse 39, which introduces 3 groups of people, believers, unbelievers, and then a third group of more ambiguous standing, those in whose hearts is sickness. Although these sick of heart may appear to be believers, they really aren't, according to this passage. This prologue is followed by an extended polemic against the Israelites and scripture owners up until verse 123 that Holger has just taken an in-depth look at. Then comes a section on the religion of Abraham and the change of the Qibla or the prayer direction, which takes us up until verse 152, so that's panel 3. And then the fourth and final part of the surah is a sizable corpus of quasi-legal commandments together with admonishments to militancy that occupies almost the entire half of the composition. What you have here is my current attempt at digesting into one diagram how I think Surah 2 may have evolved. And the starting point is an idea that was floated by Mariana in 2017, namely that what is currently the second major part of the surah, so the long polemic against the Israelites that starts in verse 40 and comes to an end in 123, that looks like an entirely credible surah in its own right. This anti-Israelite polemic is bounded by a very prominent literary bracket that induces a strong sense of closure in verses 122 and 123, and which has been discussed by Naveen Rida, among others. And such a double-braced bracket would certainly be very appropriate for a surah ending. Some precursor version of the second surah part may therefore have been the Baqarah, if you will, the original core around which secondary layers of text accumulated in a process that may well have taken several years. That's why the second major part of the surah has a little circled number 1 to the right hand side of my diagram, meaning that chronologically I conjecture that this is the nucleus of Surah al-Baqarah. So my current thinking is that this polemical surah then began to expand at the back end into what is now the third part of Surah al-Baqarah, which has a circled number 2. Like third part, if you look at the text synchronically, but chronologically, this came second in my hypothesis. The resulting text would then have been prefaced by what is now the first part of the surah, which is circled number 3 at the top. And then finally, the composition would have attracted the material on law and militancy in what is now the fourth part, almost certainly in several stages, so that's why you've got a circle number 4 for the entire second part. And within each of these parts, there's probably several steps, which I've tried to represent by indentation, but we won't have time to get into that. So in the remainder of this talk, I would like to focus on how the surah may have acquired its prologue, so on step 3 in my surah dendrochronology, if you wish. The first 40 verses of Surah 2, no, it's a long text, but it doesn't have 40 parts. The first 40 verses of Surah 2 have in fact presented scholars with a chronological puzzle. While the surah as a whole has a number of traits that very much suggest the Medinan date, the opening section in particular displays literary, thematic, and stylistic features that are strongly reminiscent of the Meccan period of the Quran, if you believe in Meccan and Medinan. We can talk about that later, Gabriel. Most importantly, the first 20 verses have a mean verse length that is almost half the surah average. And there is a close structural and lexical correspondence between Surah 2's opening verse groups and the beginnings of two Meccan surahs, surahs 27 and 31, which I've tried to map out here. There are further Meccan parallels to other verses in Surah 2's opening panel, which my commentary documents in some detail, and 3 verses in particular are downright doublets of Meccan ones. So the preceding observations could be explained by positing that some of the material in the first panel of Surah 2 is Meccan, and that this Meccan material was subsequently recycled, if that is not too disrespectful a term, to serve as a prologue of a Medinan surah. In the course of this process, this older Meccan material might then have been combined with younger Medinan statements. And the prologue's younger Medinan layer would certainly have included the denunciation of the sick of heart in verses 8 to 20 of Surah 2, which I think anticipates and undergirds the polemic against the Israelites starting in verse 40, which is a point that Neil Robinson originally made, and Sarkip's kind of convinced me that he's right there. Now, if there's indeed Meccan material in what is now the prologue of Surah 2, it does not strike me as very likely that such material would have consisted in fragmented verse scraps that were preserved outside of any compositional context, as Richard Bell famously imagined. I find it much more likely to assume that any Meccan material in Surah 2 would have been sourced from an integral surah containing a precursor version of part of Surah 2's prologue. So I'm surmising that an existing Meccan surah came to be reframed as part of Surah 2's opening panel and thereby ceased to exist as an independent composition. And then the question becomes, is it actually possible to reconstruct this hypothetical Meccan source text of Surah 2's prologue? Can we extract from Surah 2 as it stands a sequence of verses that would be plausible as an autonomous Meccan composition? And I believe that we can, although, of course, that only amounts to showing that my conjecture is possible. I mean, it doesn't show that it's the only possible model. So, for instance, I cannot claim to be able to refute the possibility that the entire prologue was more or less deliberately composed in what one might call a mechanizing style. But I do think that the result of the hypothetical extraction operation that I will try to perform actually yields a very plausible lost Meccan surah in more than one respect. So let me take you through the verses that might have made up this lost Meccan surah. I will baptize it Surah al-Andad, since 2 of the verses that it would, in my view, have included refer to supposed equals or andad of God. As I've said, the first 7 verses of Surah 2, by and large, have a conspicuously Meccan character, with almost no diction or content that is distinctly Medinan. So most of these initial 7 verses of Surah 2 are obvious candidates for being part of our hypothetical, well, my hypothetical, hopefully your hypothetical, Surah al-Andad. But there's one exception to my statement that Surah 2's opening has almost no diction or content that is distinctly Medinan. This exception concerns verses 3 and 4, which praise those, I quote, who believe in the hidden and perform prayer and spend from what we have provided for them, and who believe in what was sent down to you and what was sent down before you, and have certainty about the hereafter. As I've already noted, the opening verses of Surah 2 have a clear structural parallel in the Meccan surahs 27 and 31. And this also holds for verses 3 to 5 in particular. But in comparison to surahs 27 and 31, Surah 2 has a more detailed characterization of those who are rightly guided. Instead of the fairly concise statement in surahs 27 and 31 that those who are guided, I quote, perform prayer, give alms, and have certainty about the hereafter, Surah 2 has a rhetorically artful couplet of 2 verses, each of which can be subdivided into 3 segments or sticks. So that's 3 ABC and 4 ABC on my slide. Especially the bipartite reference to believe in what was sent down to you and what was sent down before you in verse 4 looks very Medinan to me. The distinction seems geared to a context in which the Quranic believers were confronting Jewish and perhaps also Christian scripture owners. In the context of Surah 2 in particular, this bipartite formula of belief prepares the ground for some of the surah's later criticism of the Israelites, who were condemned for failing to recognize the divine provenance of the Quranic revelation. So they are judged against basically that yardstick. This line of thinking is confirmed by the fact that other Quranic instances featuring an analogous bipartite evocation of what was sent down to you or us on the one hand and what was sent down before you are all Medinan, in my view. So against this background, the pairing of belief in what was sent down to you and what was sent down before you was probably not part of the presumed ancestor version of what are now verses 3 to 5 of Surah 2. Instead, The putative precursor version of this passage could simply have been identical with the corresponding wording in Surahs 27 and 31, which is what I've put down on this slide. So the highlighted bit, that's where I actually depart from the extant text of Surah 2. I've already noted that I would consider Surah 2's extensive comments on the sick of heart in verses 8 to 20 to be part of a Medinan layer in the prologue that serves to prepare the ground for the criticism of the Israelites from verse 40 onwards. This means that our conjectured Surah al-Andad would have continued with verses 21 to 24, which open with the vocative O people. Verses 21 to 24 were probably followed by 28 to 29. That is so, and I'll be very brief here, because verses 26 and 27, which aren't on my slide, provide meta-commentary on the presence of similes in God's revelations. And these comments do, I think, presuppose material in the passage on the sick of heart that I don't think was part of Surah al-Andad. Verse 25 could also be Medinan, so I've left it off my slide as well. So far, the sequence of topics in this hypothetical proto-surah would be comparable to the first 11 verses of the Meccan Surah 31. In both texts, we have an overture revolving around the contrast between the righteous and the sinners that segues into the theme of God as creator. This means that the thematic progression of my proposed proto-surah would conform to an extant Meccan proclamation, which provides a certain check on the textual surgery I have performed. It's also noteworthy, I think, that the second verse group of Surah al-Andad, consisting verses 21 to 24 and then 28 to 29 on the slide, is consistently formulated in the second person plural and is compellingly bounded by an inclusio that formed by the occurrence of the verb khalaqa, to create, in verses 21 and 29. So that's in transliteration for you. So this proto-canonical Surah al-Andad might then have continued with the retelling of the disobedience of Iblis and Adam in verses 34 to 39. Such a transition to narrative after the opening verse groups of Surah al-Andad would be structurally reminiscent of Surah 27, one of the two Meccan texts whose opening sections show close affinity with Surah 2. Following its opening verse group, Surah 27 transitions to a narrative section about Moses in verse 7, and both in Surah 27 and in Surah al-Andad, this transition to narrative proceeds via an elliptical use of idh, with no main clause, which I've translated as remember when here. I think it's likely that the later Meccan surah that I've surmised to have been absorbed into Surah 2's prologue continues later in the text in verses 136 to 171. These verses take a momentary interest in the pagan repudiators, the mushrikun, who are otherwise not very prominent in Surah 2. And these verses have tangible affinity with some of the passages in Surah 2's prologue that I've nominated for inclusion in Surah al-Andad. So verse 164 dwells on God's creation of the cosmic order, a theme also foregrounded in verses 22 and 29. And as Julien has reminded us, these science passages are actually rare in Medinan surahs. Verse 165 condemns the adoption of equals, andad, besides God, thus employing a word whose only other occurrence in Surah al-Baqarah comes in verse 22 earlier. Verse 168 begins with the same vocative, O people, that also opens verse 21. And these are the only occurrences of this vocative in Surah 2. And verse 168 also, like verse 36 previously, refers to Satan or the devil, as shaitan, although I do need to acknowledge that Satan does come up in later verses of Surah 2, which I wouldn't assign to Surah al-Andad. So maybe that's a slightly desperate straw to grasp at. Now, you might object that the only thing I've really done is to stitch together a couple of verse groups from the beginning and middle of Surah 2 into something that looks passably Meccan. But it's by no means obvious that it should be possible to do this, I think. If you were to kind of randomly pick a surah that is usually dated to the Medinan period, I would wager that the odds of carrying out such an extraction operation and ending up with a text that looks pretty much entirely Meccan are not high. Also, the proto-canonical surah that I've tentatively isolated from Surah 2 is not only phraseologically Meccan, but also structurally Meccan. It conforms to the frequent Meccan surah pattern described by Angelika Neuwirth that is built around the narrative middle section, which in the case of Surah al-Andad would be the brief Adam-Iblis pericope in verses 34 to 39. And finally, the text that I've reconstructed is also stylometrically Meccan. So the 27 verses that I've allocated to Surah al-Andad up until and including verse 171, if we reconstitute them as I've just envisaged, will end up having a mean verse length of 98.81 transliteration characters. That places Surah al-Andad in between surahs 31 and 39 on the one hand, and 34 and 12 on the other. And all of these are later Meccan texts according to the Surah chronology of Weil and Noldeke. Now, admittedly, a mean verse length of around 100 transliteration characters per verse, which is where my reconstruction of Surah al-Andad lands, would not as such be incompatible with the Medinan date, but the average length of verses in Surah 2 is well above 100 transliteration characters, so a little more than 137, so much higher than Surah al-Andad. So it's again not a foregone conclusion that my extraction operation should produce a text whose mean verse length is so clearly in the later Meccan range. As an addendum to this brief consideration of mean verse length dear to my heart, it is worth pointing out that all other surahs containing the word andad, so equals or rivals, show very similar mean verse length values to Surah al-Andad, this proto-canonical surah, so between 93 and 103 transliteration characters. And again, Surah al-Andad has 98, so sits right in the middle of what is a fairly small spectrum. So my hypothesis is that Surah 2 grew towards its present size by swallowing an independent later Meccan surah, a hypothesis that I think is buttressable by a combination of phraseological, structural, and stylometric considerations. This lost later Meccan surah, Surah al-Andad, was reprocessed as an envelope text around the original nucleus of Surah al-Baqarah. Surah al-Andad was split into two portions. The former and longer portion was used as the core of Surah 2's prologue, and the second shorter portion was employed as a conclusion to an interim version of Surah 2. And this reuse of an existing surah as an envelope text would, I think, have produced a bracketing effect, and bracketing is certainly a literary device that is demonstrably part of the Quran's structural repertoire. Of course, as Surah 2 then continued to grow, the original conclusion of the composition ended up being submerged by further layers of text that were incrementally appended to Surah al-Baqarah. And my diagram tries to represent this reuse of Surah al-Andad as an envelope text by the line connecting its various components, which are shaded in gray along the left-hand side. My diagram also is supposed to convey my view that a similar analysis can be carried out for the fourth part of Surah 2. So much of the material on militancy that pervades the second half of Surah 2 can, in my opinion, be recompiled into what would be a perfectly credible standalone Medinan surah, which I would tentatively baptize Surah al-Sabṛ. Just as with Surah al-Andad, the material I would assign to Surah al-Sabṛ does not only amount to a reasonably organic sequence of verse groups, but also shows structural conformity to a separately extant Quranic composition, which in this case is al-Saf 61. So I'm obviously out of time. I can't make this case in any detail, which is probably fortuitous. But what I do hope to have shown is that the final version of Surah 2 is likely to be an outcome of highly complex and also innovative redactional processes. And I'd like to just conclude with three brief follow-on remarks on this. So first, as I've written before, unlike Richard Bell, I would view such redactional work as definitely a form of artful literary composition, rather than a kind of sort of haphazard cobbling together. I mean, Shoaib earlier sort of implied that there's maybe an innate contradiction between a kind of a literary view on the Quran that looks for coherence and a redactional view. And I suppose in my work I try to explore to what extent you can't hold those two perspectives in balance and apply both of them. Second remark, the kind of surgical splitting and grafting of text that I've posited must, I think, be envisaged to have taken place in writing. I mean, this is certainly not oral composition, I don't think. And thirdly, given the amount of space that Surah 2 devotes to polemical engagements with the Israelites, I'm minded to think that it was the confrontation with the Medinan Israelites or Jews that spurred Surah al-Baqarah's leap in Surah complexity. So in my view, the ultimate trigger for the gestation of Surah al-Baqarah and its growth well beyond the dimensions of any earlier Quranic proclamation could well have been the ambition of creating a Quranic equivalent to a biblical book and thus to match the scriptural legacy of the Medinan Israelites. And that's actually where Joe's remarks on these sort of structural parallels between Surah al-Baqarah as a whole and the Pentateuch, I think, would also sit very neatly in the argument. Thank you.